Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, I am joined by Lura Forcum. She is, and I've got the email here, but I've just, here it is. Had it and lost it, but here it is. So, she's with the Independent Center, and we're going to be talking about independent voters today. She has expertise in consumer psychology, which is always very interesting, and we're going to understand the behavior of independent voters and explain why it's so important and why people are fed up with the two-party system, which is not anything new to anyone who listens to
Mhm.
this show, especially my Monday night news hour. Longtime listeners will know I left the Republican Party in 2012. I am begrudgingly a Democrat, and it is no secret to me why independent voters are the largest voting bloc in the country. Because we are stuck in a terrible two-party system that serves the interests of people. And if your net worth is below $100 million, those interests are not you. So,
Mhm.
we're going to find more about the consumer psychology behind this and how it might change elections moving forward, especially as we lose the boomers and millennials that get more into their middle age and take on more political power. So, welcome, Laura, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you, Cameron. Thank you. That was a fantastic introduction.
Well, thank
We
you very much.
we look at things very similarly.
Yes, well, let's dive right into this. To anyone who studies politics knows there are two kind of great groups politically in this country. There's those who don't vote, which is most everyone. And then of those who do vote, it's really independent swing voters that are the most important group, and the mainstream media loves to obsess over them in think pieces every election cycle of kind of which way they're going to
Hmm.
go, because how they go is going to decide the election. No one party really has enough registered voters on its own to do things without them. And so, in your view, let's just get right into it. What caused this? What do we do about it? Um, and how's it going to change this country politically?
Yeah. So what caused this, I would say, is the two parties realized it was much easier to manage a smaller group of voters that is their base, if they drove out the people who have questions, which tend to be independents. And so they have just sort of made politics less and less appealing to anybody who likes to think deeply about issues, to people who have questions about what the party line is, what the received wisdom is, right? And so it's like reasonable people don't want to participate from either party anymore because the two parties have just started to make politics dehumanizing and really absurd. If you want to have a really absurd conversation about public policy, like go look at the Republican versus Democratic framing of the issue, because it's going to be detached from reality. And I think any reasonable person in the middle is like, wait, why are we talking about these two ways of addressing the issue when there's all this space in the middle, all this agreement, right? And so it actually is really effective to consolidate power and fundraise if you are talking about how the other side is the worst thing in the world, the end of democracy as we know it, the end of the world as we know it.
Yes.
And so, like, I can see why it's effective for them. The
The destroying
problem
of
is,
America, the undermining of American values would be the GOP version of that message.
yeah,
Just to be
exactly.
clear, this is something both sides about the
Oh
same set
yeah,
of, yeah, yeah,
100%.
yeah.
In my mind, those were equal opportunity
You're not
complaints.
wrong. You're not. I was just throwing in a couple other Republican taglines in there for spice.
Hmm.
But yes, I mean,
Yeah.
both sides participate in this. Let them win, and the country is over, sort
Hmm.
of thing. Um,
Yeah.
and I think what's interesting though is, I don't know if you share this, that message resonates, as you said, very well with the base. It doesn't resonate with most of the country, which is where most
Yes.
of the country are at. Um,
And so they've dropped
yeah,
out, right? And
right.
and the reason that the Independent Center was formed is because we see this huge opportunity for enfranchising independent voters, and that those voters themselves are the way that we combat polarization and we make government be more accountable. Because as you mentioned in your introduction, increasingly in districts across the country and for the presidency, you can't win unless you win over independents. And that's actually great for democracy and for making government be more responsive, right? Because like your base is not going to cross the aisle pretty much no matter what you do, right? So you tell them you're going to do stuff, you don't deliver, and they're just like, fine, anything's better than the other guy, right? And that just relieves all of the accountability pressures from politics. But we need that, right? Otherwise, there's very little incentive to do the things you promised you do, and also to understand what voters need and deliver on it. So if you want politics to be and politicians to be more accountable, it's actually really ideal that you have to win over these independents, because the independents are the ones saying, I don't care what the party line is. I'm telling you what my concerns are, and I want to know what you're going to do about it. And I think last election cycle, they swung to Trump because Trump had a more compelling message on economic issues. Prior to that, they swung to Biden because I think they believed that Biden was the better prepared person to address the COVID issue, right? And so that swinging back and forth is what creates the accountability expectations. And that's what we think is really important. And that's why we're trying to enfranchise these voters, because as you might imagine, the parties don't particularly want them to engage politically because they're a wild card. And so there's tons of regulations that make it just very hard for independents to exercise their constitutional right to vote.
No, and that, I mean, one of the things that I've always enjoyed about state level politics and local politics is because they actually have to do stuff, the polarization is a lot less. Um,
Exactly.
and I worked in state government very briefly a long time ago. But the reality is, you actually have to do, because that's where most governing happens in this country.
Yes.
You actually have to do things. And so you end up with, a lot more, oh my goodness, how did they get Republicans over that in Kansas? Because they actually have to do stuff. Like they actually have to get, if they do not do stuff, it causes actual problems that immediately impact people's lives
Yes.
and their lives right away, sort of thing. Unfortunately, the minute you make the jump to national, you then end up with deeply entrenched polarization that just goes nowhere. And it's kind of funny because one of the reasons why things have been so stagnant is we've had almost 15, 18 years of extreme polarization where the answer to everything is we're going to do thing for the person in power, and the party out of power is saying no, 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 not under any circumstances, and then the whole thing goes down in flames. And so we really haven't gotten very much done. And so it also then becomes a race to not only do you just have to win the White House, you have to get unified government, to get anything sort of done. And Biden proved even that's not so great if you have people that are not necessarily on board with the agenda, sort of thing. And so yes, so that you end up with this, and I think this is why people feel like the system doesn't work,
Yeah.
because the system doesn't know there's no constitutional mechanism to get rid of polarization.
Yeah.
So, but it
And
sounds like that's what you guys are working on. So say more about that.
yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. I people ask me a lot, like, well, what do you think we can do about the media incentives that are leading to polarization? And what
Yeah.
can we do about the issues, the incentives in Congress that are leading to polarization? And my answer is I don't know. Because there are some extremely smart and talented people with very large budgets working on solving those problems. And I don't know how they're going to be effective. But what I can tell you is that if you bring competition into political representation by allowing independents to vote and offering an alternative that's not either party, then you are going to force the two parties to start being more responsive, right? Because they're going to have to get closer to what independents want in order to win elections. And right now, there's no competitive pressure on them at all, right? They just point at the other side and say, like, oh my God, well, you don't want that, right? And it's like, well, wait, no, where are your ideas? So I think competition is one of the only tools available to us to combat polarization. And it's a thing that's available right now, because what we're saying at the Independence Center is we want you to vote and participate in politics in a nonpartisan manner, which doesn't have to mean that you vote for an independent candidate or a third party candidate. It just means when you go to the polls, you're picking what you think is best and what you think is correct for ballot initiatives and for elected office. And it might be straight ticket Democrat, it might be straight ticket Republican. It might be a mix, right? You might swing vote, you might split ticket vote. The important thing is that we're getting these nuanced, nonpartisan thinkers back engaged in politics, because that's what's going to make it so that you can't count on the base. If you're a party, you have to actually go and deliver. And I think it will bring them closer to the middle, right? Because you're going to have to speak to a swath of voters that right now you're just saying like, well, who cares, right? Like they don't vote anyway.
No, and I love that you mentioned split ticket voting because one of the big stories of the 2024 election, and poor Steve Kornacki over at MSNBC almost had a little meltdown about this, was the prevalence of split ticket voting.
Mm-hmm.
And what was very interesting is one, Trump didn't win by that tremendous of a margin. And in some states, the vote
Yep.
count was less than 10,000 votes, looking at you, Wisconsin. That's the
Mm-hmm.
first story. They didn't get a mandate from heaven, they squeaked by.
Yeah.
In fact, Biden's margin was larger. Um, Two, you also had a high the wipeout for Democrats. They anticipated they were going to lose everything in the House, and it was not that bad. The Republican majority is 2 seats,
Mm-hmm.
sort of thing. The Senate map was bad because the Senate map was favoring Republicans anyway. And there were a
Yeah.
couple easy seats for them to pick up, like John Tester in Montana, which is really sad because he was really great and he was a very nice, moderate, normal Democrat who like still ranches and things. Um, so and it was good to pull the party a little bit out of the crazy zone. But it was not as bad down ballot, even at the state level, where Democrats actually did very well, than they anticipated. And one of the things was the high prevalence of split ticket voting. It was quite obvious that when it came for president, they were not on board the Harris Waltz train by any stretch of the imagination, um, or vice versa. But at the state level, there were much people who Trump voters were much more comfortable voting for Democrats at a state and local level than they were voting for Harris Waltz
Mm-hmm.
specifically, sort of thing. And I think you're going to get your wish, was my point of by saying this, is that I think we're going to start, I think that's going to become the norm moving forward. And it'll be interesting to see what the data is in 26.
Mm-hmm.
Because there won't be any big top of the ticket
Right.
polarization draw. It'll be very interesting to see it because if Democrats end up doing very well, or Republicans don't do as bad as we think they will, and you start to see the data of kind of of how the vote went down, I think that's going to start to become the norm where people are just picking the best person from both
Yes.
sides, whatever that may be for them. Um, and I do agree with you. I think that will be good for that will be good for democracy. However, I do wonder how that is going to affect a presidential election in 2028.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of one of the great things about Make America Great Again as a slogan. Sorry, there's a hair right there and I can see it. It's annoying me. About that is that you can make that whatever you want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
It as a political slogan, you honestly can't do much better, I don't think. And I wonder how this idea of being able to kind of pick the best of both parties is going to work when you're really stuck with a binary choice because our political system. That's a whole other we can talk about
Yeah.
ranked choice voting in a minute. Sort of thing. I wonder how that, how that's going to affect it in 28 in terms of what is your guys' hope that both parties will come more to the middle or that it'll just change the rhetoric around the race entirely.
So I would say our goal is to enfranchise independents because there are too many barriers to their political participation and they have a constitutional right to vote.
Right.
And in some states, depending on how the state's laws are for voter registration and how primaries are run, all of this stuff, right? Like it can make
Right.
it very hard for independents to exercise that right. And so, we don't have sort of like a vision for how this will play out in a presidential election. I would tell you that I know there are parties like Forward Party and No Labels, and when they're talking about trying to get a president elected, I think it's a really laudable goal, but I also think it is incredibly unlikely to succeed just because of like how deeply entrenched partisan politics is in the United States. I think trying to start with a presidency is is just like a high risk endeavor, right? It really depends on looking at this third party candidate and Americans saying like, yeah, I'm crazy about that person, like so much so that I don't want either of these two known quantities in the parties. So that's where I think targeting House districts is actually a lot better way to go because this is much smaller stakes. And the thing about House districts that's really valuable, again, for decreasing polarization, for making it so that people want to work across the aisles in Washington, is that if you elected just a handful of independents, like you said, the margin in the House is very slim in favor of Republicans. Even a handful of a handful of independents would make it so that you have to nobody has a majority, right? Like you
Right.
have to govern with independents. It would make those individuals very powerful in Congress. And it would just take away the majority. You would have to consult with them and come up with policy that is more broadly appealing rather than just doing what they're doing now, which is saying, haha, we have the majority. Right. And like that winner takes all approach is terrible for democracy. It's very unstable, right? It's just like this ping pong ball where it's like, oh, now we have the majority. We're going to do all this stuff that we want. And now we have it and we're putting everything back. That type of political uncertainty causes a lot of economic instability. And it's not good for solving the bigger issues that plague our country that are going to take multiple years and multiple election cycles to address. So that's where I think not only would having some independence in the House create these larger pressures around depolarization, it would make the House a more effective governing body.
No, yes, I mean, I've always, of any third party situation, you always want to start at a lower, more achievable level,
Mm-hmm.
sort of thing. And that because it is cheaper, it's more effective, and I agree with you. I hadn't considered how it would change the governing dynamics of the House. That's a very interesting idea. I do. I do think there is a certain hunger for something else. One of the big stories of the kind of the other story in the Trump era that we never talk about is the popularity of third parties.
Mm-hmm.
It is well known that in a lot of the swing states in 2016, massive third party voting definitely drew away Clinton voters. Um, in
Mm-hmm.
2020, the effect was more muted, possibly due to the pandemic, but in 2024, they were roaring back. Um, and obviously, the Green Party and the Libertarian Party, being kind of the two only really nationally known third parties, have capitalized on this, and they're starting to get a not insignificant amount of the vote share. I mean, they're really
Mm-hmm.
starting to rank up the numbers. You're starting to get, Green Party did 1.2 million last cycle. So and for a winner take all first past the post system, which we're stuck with, thank you, Great Britain, sort of thing for that little gift. For that, it is I think it is a clear signal people are looking for something different.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you guys can start galvanizing, if you can get some combination of independent voters voting for great third parties at the state and house district level sort of thing, that can become a quite potent political force. Because as we've seen, it won't take much to get people off the R&D
Mm-hmm.
plantation and into a new sort of thing. That could become quite politically potent. And you're absolutely right. If we had two independents in the House, well, that's Mike Johnson's whole legislative program underwater.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah, exactly.
that,
And he
yes.
would have to get some bipartisan support for these initiatives rather than taking the current point of view, which just seems to be, you know, it's like that game of that kids play of like, why are you punching yourself? I feel like that's what politics in especially in the House looks like these days. And
Yeah.
it's just, like you were alluding to earlier, it's not like that in state legislatures. It's not like that in your city council because people want their schools to open, right? They need the
Yes.
roads paved, they need water,
Hmm.
they need sewage treatment to work,
Yeah,
right?
they need the
Like,
water to come in and the sewage to go out. Yes.
exactly. When these things don't happen, life as we know it starts to fall down or fall
Yes.
apart. And DC is not dealing, they're not working within those constraints. So they can keep having this very absurd approach to political life. And that's one of the things that we say at the Independence Center a lot is, and I think this is something a lot of our audience agrees with. It's like, if you're talking about your personal relationships, if you're talking about your neighbors and your community, if you're talking about your faith community or your workplace, right? Like those are all places where you are connected with people who don't share identical views with you. And yet you manage to get along, you manage to work together, and you manage to find consensus, right? It's only DC where apparently they can't figure out how to do that. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so frustrating to voters and makes them drop out of civic participation because they're looking at what should be leaders of our country and just saying, this is absurd that you would behave in this manner that like none of the rest of us engage in our daily lives, right? It's just this
Yeah.
political class. And so I understand why independents look at that and are frustrated and are just like, you know what? I don't need that. But what we're really hopeful that people will do is say, okay, you're right. Like we, just by participating, we can decrease some of the incentives in the current political left-right divide.
No, I mean, it's one of the overarching narratives of this show is I grew up very Republican, worked in Republican politics, was in Young Republicans, state treasurer, chapter president, national delegate 2009. I ran a Tea Party magazine shortly after that and was very involved, was there on day one. And then at the end of that, I started covering Occupy as a journalist, eventually got involved, and that was when I decided to leave because I kind of saw where some of this was coming from. I didn't necessarily predict Trump early on, but I saw where things were going and I was ready to get off. And I also saw how the economy that I thought worked for everyone was not working for a lot of people. And kind
Mhm.
of most importantly, it wasn't working for me post the financial crisis. Um, and that led to a whole bunch of other journeys, and inspirations, and that's how you and I are sitting here talking today. Um, and one of the hallmarks of this show is its tremendous moderation on a lot of topics. And I have long joked this show would be 10 times as popular if I were 100 times more partisan.
Mhm.
Um, and it's kind of like people are always very impressed by that because it doesn't really exist anymore. Um, but I can tell you, social media does not really raise up the moderate, nuanced sort of
Yeah.
voice. Social media is optimized for the most extreme view.
Yes.
So, what part does the modern information environment, which one argues that's where the battle's taking place now, how does
Mhm.
the modern information environment affect this polarization, and how does that more moderate, nuanced, independent voice sort of break through the algorithms that are optimized for polarization?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And there's a lot of ink has been spilled on this topic, but I'll tell you, so two things that come from my background in
Yeah.
consumer psychology. One of the things is that we know that what predicts people sharing information online is what's called the emotional arousal, which is just like how much energy is behind that emotion. It's not the valence. So you might think that it's like happy things that people want to share, but that's not actually true. It's not whether it's happy or sad, it's whether there's energy behind it. And energy comes from people being outraged, right? Like So you can imagine immediately the implications that has for social media, because people share stuff and they view it and they click on it and they comment on it based on their emotional response to it. So if it makes you outraged, you're far more likely to share it than if you're like, oh, what a nice story. Right. And so if you think about like what are the emotions that are evoked from being a moderate, right? It's like, well, let me refrain from responding emotionally and think about this rationally. Let me understand, right? Like, let me suppress my negative feelings and understand what this person who disagrees with me, what they're really saying and what this means to them. And let's see where we can go from there, right? Like, that's way lower arousal. So you can see right there why we're not going to get virality from the type of perspective that you're having, right? And like that's
Yeah.
exactly your point. If you would spew outrage, yes, I'm sure that you could quadruple your audience. However, I'm very thankful that you're not doing that. I'm sure your audience is also very thankful that you are refraining. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and the other thing that I think is really important, and I don't hear people sharing or talking about this enough. So the problem with the media bubble that we know exists from from all of these algorithms and from different ways of approaching content moderation is that we have two separate shared realities. And so shared reality
Yes.
is this idea from psychology that it's kind of shocking how much our perception of the world around us is actually really easily shaped by our social connections, right? So like there's all these experiments in psychology showing people looking at bars of different length on a paper, and the group will agree about something about the length of these bars, right? And be like, oh, they'll agree with something that's totally divorced from reality. And you can see this effect in experiments again and again and again. It's the group's thinking that determines what reality means. Um, and so the problem is that with the bubbles that we have of polarized media content, we're ending up with two separate realities. And you can kind of see that in the fact that, like, for example, Republicans looked at Joe Biden's mental capacity and said, hey, there's a problem here. And all Democrats looked at it and said, nope, it's absolutely not a problem, right?
Okay.
Like that type of breakdown of shared reality is super concerning because
January 6th. It was just some
it
tourists
was
having fun.
exactly
Democrats,
same
it's an
thing.
insurrection.
Thank you. Yes,
You
totally.
know,
But that breakdown of shared reality
yes.
makes it nearly impossible to govern together. And that is a tremendous problem because it's like the more extreme those two shared realities get, the harder it is to reach across and say, like, no, no, we actually have a ton of things in common. And that's not just, there's empirical support for that. That's not just me being Pollyanna and saying, hey guys, we can get along. No, there's tons of evidence of just how close together most Americans are on policy issues. So the fact that we have all this vitriol is insane because we're actually like very closely aligned on a wide range of policy issues.
Well, and I think one of the sad things is a lot of the most vitriolic stuff is, to be very honest, a lot of low-hanging fruit on social issues.
Hmm.
And that, and I always kind of just like, it's like, notice we never have multiple days of dialogue on Twitter on anything that actually matters.
Hmm.
And I'm chronically online. This never happens. And there's a reason for that. Because to your point, a nice, kindly considered, policy on education is not going to get anybody's heartbeat raised or thumb.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Um, that's just not going to be not going to be a thing. And so, but if we can have, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats in Ohio, that will be everywhere
Yes.
because it triggers the right thing psychologically.
Absolutely, right? Because the people who are, right, like if you're a Republican and you look at that, you go like, haha, that's funny. I know it's a joke, right? And if you're a Democrat, you say, oh my God, look at how insane this is, right? So you actually
Right.
are getting juice from both sides,
Yes.
right? And I feel like people who are successful online understand how to use that specific tool of getting, it's like you get the hate reads and you get the love reads, right? And
Yes.
it's incredibly divisive. It's not good for us. You know, I mean, I can like wag my finger all day long and say, hey guys, go outside, like the nation's mother. But I won't because I don't think that that's actually effective. Like we all know we need to, that some of these things are really destructive. I think really the only tool available to us is to say, your political participation matters. And like, you know, if you don't feel like you're a Democrat or Republican, like, cool, you can be one of us. We don't have a litmus test, right? Like you can sit at our
Right.
table.
Yeah.
You know, we're people who want to see good people elected to office, decent people elected to office. We want to see public policy that treats other people with dignity. And, you know, maybe if we can get the country back on track to a little bit more political health, we won't need independence in the long run, right? Like maybe we'll get back to a place where people say like, no, you know what? This party actually fits me really well. A third party is not, as it turns out, what we needed. You know, that's not up to me. That's a question for voters. I think the thing in the medium term here that we think is hugely important is to make it so that independents want to participate and so that people who don't feel like they're part of either party, those are actually the people we need the most to engage.
Yes, yes. I quite agree. How do you guys feel about ranked choice voting?
So we think ranked choice has a lot of really important benefits. We partner with a couple of different organizations that are much better equipped to speak about how this works and why it's important. And I assume your listeners are pretty familiar. Do you talk about it on the show, or is?
I do. I've the reason I ask is because Australia's had ranked choice voting for a long time. We've also seen it work for a presidential race in Alaska in 24
Mhm.
because they have just implemented ranked choice
Right.
voting for all races and everything. There's also several large cities that do it. New York has it, Seattle has it, I think Chicago also has it. It's starting to percolate a
Hmm.
little bit, sort of thing.
Hmm.
And so I was kind of wondering what your guys' thought on that was. If you, and I was hoping you would be in favor of it because yes, I mean being able to, and I'm going to ask you this question and also explain what it is in the same. Watch me do this. So the nice thing about ranked choice voting is that you get to, you know, a bunch of people get to run. You get to list them in the order that you like them from
Hmm.
however many there are. That's how many spots there are. You get to rank them one through whatever. And then if your first choice wins, great, your ballot's done being counted. If not, then they keep going until they find a person that has a majority that you have voted for, sort of thing. And then that ends up being who wins. And in my mind, the only way we're ever going to break the two-party political duopoly in this country, which is really a uniparty owned by the wealthy, but that's another show. Is by having ranked choice voting in all states nationwide. Because that actually gives third parties a chance to really be viable. I mean, it's
Hmm.
hard even at the local level to win a winner take all. Oh, city council maybe not so bad, but once you get the state level, it's hard to get a winner take all situation. In my mind, having ranked choice voting would be tremendous.
Yeah, I think it could really significantly shift some voting dynamics, especially where you you could stop people from thinking about what is the least bad option, right?
Yes.
To thinking like, okay, if that doesn't work, what's the next choice? And one of the
Right.
things that I also think is really important and doesn't get said enough about ranked choice voting is if you only want to pick your top choice, you can. You can
Right.
continue to vote the way you always have voted. But for
Yes.
people who want to go beyond that and rank further down the list additional candidates, that's also something that you can do. Because I worry, one of my worries about ranked choice is that it sounds to people who are already on the fence about political participation, like making it so much harder. And I worry,
Yes.
like as a psychologist, I worry about giving people the impression that voting is complicated or that it takes a whole lot of preparation in order to be able to vote, right? To be prepared to vote, because I worry about who's going to decide in those circumstances to stay home. Right. It's going to be the people who are
Yeah.
most economically pressed, the people with less education, the people who are not as sure about their opinions. And we need their votes, right? Like we need to know what they think. Like, right. Like I think it's gotten so tribal talking about political participation, but
Oh,
like at the
yes.
end of the day, your voting is like how we know what's important to you and how we know what you need and how we know how you prioritize things. And so if we are systematically keeping people out of political participation, we don't know what they need. We don't know what their values are. And that's the real issue here.
No, I mean, I will agree. I think Um, yeah, I think the voter overwhelm is very, very real. And I've already seen this when you have a cycle where you have a lot of ballot measures in your state and people
Mm-hmm.
get overwhelmed, or they're trying to vote for judges and you have no clue who any of these people are. You haven't even
Mm-hmm.
seen a yard sign because no
Mm-hmm.
one cares, sort of thing. Um, and it would, and I've seen, especially younger people or first time voters, because I had a lot of buddies. I got into voting regularly to vote for legalization of weed in their state, and that actually got them in the habit of voting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I've sat with people, all this sort of thing. And I agree, you get into some of the ballot initiatives and all this type of thing. And I've had, especially in 24, me and a couple friends, it was a lot of Gen Zers first time voting, and Colorado happened to have a lot of ballot initiatives that year, and I'm sitting on them, on FaceTime, and I'm kind of like, you can read them, you can make snap decisions, you can look in the blue book and read about them a little bit more, or you can skip them and vote for
Mm-hmm.
what's important, go from there, sort of thing. And some went through and did it all, and some just said asterisk. And
Mm-hmm.
so I do agree. I think there's definitely a huge voter education piece in
Mm-hmm.
there that would have to happen to make that work and be viable. But the thing that I love the most about it is that both major parties are mad about Alaska doing it. And that fills
Yes.
my little heart with with joy. It's like
That
if it's annoying the two major parties, I'm instantly more in favor of it than I was 5 minutes ago. So
Absolutely. I think anywhere the parties are in strong agreement, we should all take a closer look, right?
yes.
Because that there's a good reason that they are fighting tooth and nail on things like ranked choice, things like open primary, right?
Yes.
Like these concern them because they would love to protect themselves from competition. And I don't fault them for that. Everybody would love to do business in an environment where there's no competition. The problem is that it's making voters worse off. And I think you and I are in total agreement here of like this is harming
No,
voters, and it's
yes.
it's just not fair. It's not democratic.
No, I was every once in a while a video of it resurfaces. I'm not to presume a lady's age, but I'm assuming we're both old enough to remember Ross Perot.
Barely.
And
No, I'm kidding.
yes,
I totally
yes.
remember.
No, I was born in 88. I was 4 years old, so I don't really consciously remember of it, but I remember my parents talking about it, and I've seen videos since then about it. And one of the big things they did after that is they changed the rules of presidential debates to prevent that from ever happening again. And if
Mhm.
you want a really surreal experience, go watch Ross Perot in the 92 election and watch him basically look at the president, Bush Sr., and Bill Clinton, the nice governor from Arkansas, and basically tell the country, these two are doing nothing for you. If you'd like to not have either of these two, find my name. So I mean, and the major parties got so scared about that because he had a groundswell of support. They
Mhm.
literally had to change the system to keep him out of it. That really was the last time we had a viable third party candidate for president, and people kind of wonder how we used to do it. And I said, this whole two party duopoly is a very modern phenomena.
Mhm.
It's a post World War II phenomena. This was not the case before 1940.
Mhm.
Third, fourth, fifth party, what were all the time. We ended Reconstruction because no one had a majority electoral college in 1876. And Rutherford B. Hayes got a majority by saying he would end Reconstruction because it was a three-way split.
Hmm.
You know, you sort of, I mean, that's how politics was done in the 19th century. It was a mix.
Hmm.
There was none of this two-party control everything to up. No, 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 no. And you had third-party candidates winning states in presidential elections as late as 1948. The last one was Strom Thurmond, who was
Oh,
running as a
interesting.
segregationist party and won three states in the South in
Oh,
1948. Yeah, but by
huh.
the time you get into Eisenhower in 52, you start to have you start to have that two-party duopoly sort of the M by 60 it's done.
Hmm.
I was like, so really in the history of the Republic, this is an anomaly. People in the
Hmm.
19th century would find it very odd that we're
Right.
stuck in between two parties that neither of them liked at the time and would be like, vote for anybody else. Like, come on, everyone, just start voting for other people. They would find it very odd that
Hmm.
this has happened. So I say all that to say with a little bit of history lesson in eschatology, the study of
Hmm.
elections, to say I love what you're doing, I love what you're advocating for, and I vote you immediately, because that what you're talking, that's how our country's supposed to work. That's
Hmm.
how the Constitution. We're not. We're people think we're destroying American democracy. No, we're just going back to how the system used to work before 1948. Like it's really that simple.
Yeah,
And
before they figured out how to shut out other
yes,
voices, right?
yes, yes, yes,
And
yes.
you can only, I think the thing about representative democracy is that when you shut off these feedback mechanisms, you create real problems for yourself. That's, countless monarchs in Europe who no longer have their heads. If they could talk, they would tell you feedback from the masses is maybe something that you should listen to. And the problem with what we've done through the two-party system is that we have made it impossible for people to voice their feedback because we've cut off real competition in politics. And yeah, I totally agree with you. I think this is a really unhealthy dynamic. I also think that there's something about pairs of two in psychology that actually can be um, really unhelpful to our thinking. So it's called like a dyad or like dualism, where what we see is what our brains construct is if one side is being hurt, it means the other side is the hurter. And it means if one side is good, the other side is bad, right? Like that type of, it's called completion. That type of completion, I think, is really easy for our brains to do. And it's really unhelpful because just because you don't like the Republican Party doesn't mean that the Democratic Party is doing things for you in your favor, right? And the reverse is also true, but it's just so easy, right? Like our brains are just inclined to that type of completionist thinking. And it's
No, I
really
talk a lot about
unhelpful.
foreign policy, and I tell people, I said, you got to leave that thinking behind. It will not do you any
Hmm.
good. Because once you get into international relations, that type of thing, you can go to a conflict where there are two participants and both are bad.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. And
That
our
and
brains don't register that, right? We're like,
it's
no, no,
very
no,
yeah
I'm still
yeah.
trying to figure out which one is good and which one is bad.
And
You're
the
like,
answer is
neither.
neither. That yes,
We need
no,
to have that conversation more. Absolutely.
yeah, both can be bad for different reasons. There can be good parts to both for different reasons.
Hmm.
Um, and yes, and that's a very important dynamic to understand. And that's especially true in politics. And that some of us don't remember when that's how most people thought about the parties. And most people thought about it. It used to be very, very rare anybody was a diehard anything.
Hmm.
That was not when I was growing up in the 90s, that was not a thing at all. No one
Yeah.
really thought like sort of thing. I mean, you had a handful of people, obviously if you were, a big union person back then, you probably always voted Democrat no matter what. Um and when I was worked for Republican politics, we joked about the Republican Party was really just the Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber of Commerce vote always votes Republican sort of thing. But that was not John Q. Public. That wasn't most people in the street, and you had shades of that kind of moderate towards the center, more extreme towards
Hmm.
the very edges. And I think, unfortunately, both the far right and the far left have pulled the parties
Hmm.
away from the center, leading to the conversation we're having today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at what it's like to engage around political conversation right now, you've basically caused everybody to drop out except the people who are fine with name calling, right?
Yes,
The people who are fine with dehumanizing people who don't agree with them,
yes.
right? Like the stakes of political participation have just gotten really high, and they've made it so, like, of course, you're making this like gesture where they're opposed to each other and really far apart. Like, of course everybody in the middle is dropped out and you're left with extremes. um
And your candidate quality goes down. I mean,
Yes.
between Occupy and the progressive movement on the left and the Tea Party, a lot of more moderate, agreeable Republicans and Democrats both either got voted out or ran
Hmm.
for the exits because they saw what was happening.
Yes.
And people, there's a lot of candidates, especially in like 10, because you had a lot of Republicans getting a vote, Democrats, sort of thing. In 10 and 12, you had a lot of candidate churn.
Hmm.
And even in 12, into 16, tons of candidate churn to where now the people that are attracted to politics and are attracted to run and all this type of thing
Yes.
are much more extreme voices. And that goes for the Pramila Jayapals, Ilhan Omar's, Rashida Tlaib's, as well as the Giant Crenshaws, Marjorie Taylor Greenes, and Lauren Boeberts. Yes, I'm going after
100%.
everybody. I
I
have a gun
totally
and we're
agree.
shooting both ways today. Kabang! So, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's whereas in an earlier political time, all six of those people probably would not have been politically viable.
Hmm. Yep.
And some of them, like AOC and Pramila Jayapal, are only viable. And I used to live in Pramila Jayapal's district. They're only viable because they come from very, very deeply one-sided districts. Pramila Jayapal
Exactly.
represents Seattle, which is very, very deep blue.
Hmm.
AOC represents an extremely safe, like D plus 15 district in New York. Rashida Tlaib, same situation. Ilhan Omar will always get the Somalian vote in Minnesota just because she's Somali, sort of thing. And but also could choose MTG. She comes from Georgia, a rural part of Georgia. She's a Republican. You could put Republican next to a ham sandwich; they'd send it to the house.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, but the unfortunate part is when those are your loudest voices, and this goes back into your thing about psychology. Perception is reality.
Hmm.
And I have leftist friends who will believe that they are all about the Republican Party, and I will have more Republicans who say they are all that's all Democrat sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I just kind of stand here doing my little show in the middle to be kind of like, or we could ignore all six of them and
Yes, and
do
talk to
something
reasonable
else.
people. But
Yeah.
the thing that you're talking about, this phenomenon of candidate quality going down, is a real concern because governing is complex, especially if you're talking about how complicated it is to pass a piece of legislation or even hear a piece of legislation in
Mhm.
Congress, right? Like budget processes are incredibly arcane. We need high quality candidates. And I would challenge anybody, go ask the most decent person that you know if they would consider running for national office, running for Congress. They're going to
Mhm.
say no.
No.
Decent people are dropping out. Decent people don't
Yes.
want to do this job because we have made it intolerable. The rewards are for people who like yelling on Twitter and like calling people names. The
Yes.
rewards are not there for people who are disinterested in power and disinterested in money. So, how are we going to start getting candidates of high quality back into office? It's incredibly difficult, right? But like that is the answer. We're going to have to reduce the rewards to deep polarization.
One of the things that you will get amazing bipartisan support for is getting money out of politics.
Hmm.
I could walk in to a Lincoln Day dinner in a Trump plus 10 district, stand on the stage and say, let's get money out of politics to rapturous applause. I
Hmm.
could walk in to the Seattle Tennis Club with in the most blue area in a room full of dyed in the wool blue, never voted for a Republican their entire lives room, stand on the stage and say, let's get money out of politics to rapturous applause. You
Hmm.
know the only two institutions that are invested in that never happening? Well, three. The two major parties who make a lot of money off of it and wealthy donors who love to control American politics.
Yeah.
when those and so when you talk about that when you talk about candidates, it's like, yeah, when half of a job of being elected person is to fundraise,
Hmm.
sort of thing. And that's, and my old friend Ken Buck, who used to be in the fourth in Colorado, where Boebert is, because she got thrown out of Western Colorado, had to move to the east side of the state to get a seat because she almost lost by 400 votes a couple years ago, and they got rid of her and she had to move over there. He was retiring. He talks about that in a documentary about, is like, yeah, I spent half my time, and that's one of the reasons he got the hell out, is he was tired of that whole thing. I mean, you have, even now, the DNC is still using Kamala Harris's name to
Hmm.
fundraise. I know, because I get their emails. Sort of thing. I mean, and all these things become fundraising issues. There's way too much money involved. The average person can't even get into it unless they either have deep pockets themselves, a la Trump,
Hmm.
or even at the local level, they have deep pockets themselves, or they can align themselves with someone who does. And that's where you get someone like JD Vance, who is financed by Peter Thiel.
Hmm.
And that's where you start getting, some of these, different, groups of people who, pick people out. And when you're going off someone who's good at what you're talking about and is really good for fundraising, we get what you're just talking
Yes,
about.
exactly.
Not people who are just, let's make a great country that does things for everybody, great, and then let's hurry the hell out of here. No, it then becomes a who can fundraise the best, who can get the most attraction onto it, who can cause the most fuss, sort of thing. And they
Hmm.
even, popular people will even out of the House and Senate will kind of overestimate the political will because of likes on Twitter. Honestly, Kamala Harris kind of suffered from that. She
Hmm.
became very well known for asking a lot of very poignant questions in the Senate, which did very well on social media, went viral, all this type of thing, didn't make it to her own state's primary in 20. Because the voter enthusiasm was just not there. Meanwhile, Biden kind of comes out of nowhere, gets Jim Clyburn to endorsement South Carolina, and Bob's your uncle.
Hmm.
Smooth sailing after that. It's a very odd, but what we don't get is the wonderful, decent people you're talking about who would just show up and be like, how do we make America better for everybody?
Hmm.
How do we actually make America great again, even?
Hmm.
Um, and that ends up with, again, low quality people who are really good at raising money and getting in fights on Twitter.
Exactly.
But you can't govern a country that way.
No, you
And
not, I mean, or you can, but you see what it looks like,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So
Like
we have been, and the result is here.
we're
Yes,
trying it,
yeah,
and I
yeah,
have questions.
yes. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Well, we're reaching the top of the hour. I don't mean to keep you all after because we could go on and on,
We
but
we really could.
why don't you let us know where we can get in touch with you online and keep up with y'all's work at the organization?
Thank you. So we're at independencenter.org. And you can find all kinds of resources there if you're interested in what it looks like to register as an independent in your state or vote as an independent, or if you're interested on some takes on policy issues that are not just like what the two parties say. We have some more deeply informed ways of looking at public policy. We have a lot of polling about what independents think about different issues. Um, and we also have just started a campaign that we're calling Declare Your Independence. So if you want to reach out and tell us like why you're an independent, if you are, that is www.independencenter/declare. So you can get on there and tell us. And we've been getting all kinds of feedback from people that are just saying, just saying stuff that warms my heart, probably would warm your heart as a neither party guy, right? And they're just saying like, neither of these parties is doing anything. And I just don't feel like I'm a member of either party. So if you feel like you're politically homeless, like come join us. You're not, we're trying to build a home for you and for other independent voters. And I'd love to hear from you. We have a week newsletter we send out every other week so you can kind of stay in touch on stuff. And we are starting to put together some in-person events. So we'd like to have some like small gatherings around the country for people who likewise feel like what you're talking about, Cameron. Um,
No, no, thank you. That is absolutely, absolutely tremendous. Well, thank you for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
thank you so much.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.